Hi, this is Ron with Mobile Fix Automotive, and today I'm going to show you how to change a water pump on a 2009 Toyota Corolla Type S. This has the 1.8 liter in it. There is a 2.0 or 2.4 engine option. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it's a 2.4. Those water pumps and the 1.8s are different. They're not the same. So the one we're dealing with today is the 1.8. And it's a fairly simple replacement. That's why I'm going to shoot the video for it. And I'm going to walk you through step by step on what we need to do to get this done. So the first step we're going to do is we're going to be removing the engine beauty cover, sound deadening material. And the thing I like to do, you don't have to, is right here is the dipstick for the engine oil dipstick. This is how you check the oil. These things like to snap off really easy when they get old and brittle. So I recommend pulling it out of the engine, wiping it off so you don't drip oil, and just setting it aside. Because what we're going to do is we're going to be taking this panel off. And to get this panel off, you notice there's no nuts or bolts holding it down. It's just a pinch clip, that's all it is. So you're going to put a hand under each side and just pop up in all four corners, and it should just lift off. It's just a dust cover, noise suppressor, that's all it is. Okay, once that's off, it gives us a little bit more access to the front of the engine. And one of the complaints that this came in for is actually a noise in the engine, not so much a water leak that they weren't sure that they even had. So when I had the engine running, which I'm not going to do for you on the video, because one, it's going to make the engine hot, which I don't want to work on with a hot engine, and two, you're really not going to hear the noise on the video the way it's going to sound in real life. It never works out that way. But what I did to troubleshoot it, and I will show you what I did, is if my assistant Justin comes in here closer, I am going to get another light down in here and grab a screwdriver out of my drawer. And so follow the point of my screwdriver. That's going to be my pointing device. This pulley right here, can you see that okay? That pulley right there is your water pump pulley. And I basically put my screwdriver behind it and just turned it, and you can see how that pulley moves really easy. So that's because the bearings in the water pump are bad. Now, if you put a screwdriver down in there and turn it really hard against its will, you'll probably get a little flex out of the pulley to begin with, but you can use a competency test to see, yeah, that's moving around pretty easy, so that means that there's play in the bearing. That's where the noise is coming from. So the first thing that we have to do, officially, it's a good idea at this point to disconnect the negative battery cable on your battery, so that in the event that you're a do-it-yourselfer and you're not, you don't understand all the things that can go wrong, it's always best to disconnect the battery anytime you repair anything on the engine. In this particular case, I'm not going to be doing anything that's going to be touching electrical. So I myself, I'm going to leave the battery connected so that all the memories in the radio and seats and everything else don't get wiped out. If you're doing this at home and you're not sure, go ahead and disconnect your negative cable on your battery, which is this one right here, the one that does not have the red post on it. And once that's disconnected and set out of the way, you're safe to mess with stuff, and you want what we call the smoke out. So the second thing that we normally do in the shop is we put it up in the air and we drain the coolant from the radiator. In this particular case, I'm going to do this the easy way, and I'm going to drain the coolant when I pull the water pump. It's going to kind of all happen at the same time. So the one thing I will do is I will take the radiator cap and remove it from the vehicle. And I'm just going to set it up on the top of the cowl and get it out of the way. Now I'm going to identify what tools I need. I'm going to have to loosen the fan belt, which we're going to be replacing today also. I'm going to have to loosen this fan belt, and it's loosened through the alternator, which is done by loosening this bolt right here at the top of the alternator, and then there should be another bolt at the bottom of the alternator, and then the adjusting screw which is also at the top of the alternator. So let's go ahead and get our tools. It looks like we're going to need a 12 millimeter for the two top and a 14 millimeter from the bottom, for the bottom. Okay, so the first tools that I'm going to use is I'm going to use a 3/8 ratchet. Okay, and yes, mine has a really long handle on it. This just gives me more leverage. You can use a standard ratchet for this, it's not a big deal. I'm going to use a 14 millimeter deep socket, and I'm going to use a 12 millimeter deep socket. And the reason why I'm going to use a deep socket on a shallow bolt head is because I need to be able to stick out past other items to get them loose. So I'm going to put one of them on my magnet out of the way, and I'm going to start with the 14 millimeter, and I'm going to go down in here. And if you can see this bolt at the bottom of the alternator, can you see that? Okay, I'm going to basically break this loose, and you're going to hear it make all kinds of noises. Sorry if I hit the camera, my bad. So I'm going to loosen this up just a little bit, and then I'm going to take the 14 millimeter off, and I'm going to switch over to a 12. Now, here's kind of a little secret that helps things out. See this adjusting screw? You're going to have to wind this thing out to get the alternator to go forward to loosen the slack. One of the tricks is before you even loosen this bolt that tightens the alternator down, go ahead and just back this thing off. Sometimes it'll be so loose you can unscrew it by hand. If you have electric wrenches, go ahead and use that. The deep's a little long for that, so I'm going to switch over and use a ratcheting wrench. But the reason why I'm doing it this way is it's a heck of a lot easier to do this than it is to do it while it's under tension. So you just back it out. You know, as long as your thread right here is still sticking through this nut, you're not going to have stuff fall apart on you. The slinky won't come apart, so to speak. Anybody remember Slinkies? Fun and wonderful toy. Okay, so now I'm going to take my 12 millimeter, and like I said, I'm using it deep because I got to get out past this. It's kind of hard to do this with a wrench, but there's a bolt right here. It's got a 12 millimeter head on it. And once that's loosened, you see how the alternator dropped? Okay, now that that's in, now before you pull your belt off, look down in there. You're not going to be able to see it on mine, but look down and verify which pulleys that belt goes around and how it goes around. On this particular vehicle, it comes up. Let me get my other flashlight. So the fan belt on this has an alternator and a water pump and an air conditioner. So the pull from the crank pulley down on the bottom, which is your big one with the big nut in the center of it, it comes straight up and it goes over the alternator, comes around, and then it goes around the water pump on the smooth side, and then comes back around the air conditioner and then goes back over to the pulley. So that's how mine is set up on this vehicle. Make sure yours is the same way. I know if yours does not have air conditioning, the belt routing is different. So just make sure you watch how it comes off. Go ahead and pull your belt off. And in some cases, if you're gonna reuse your belt, the easy thing to do is just take and hang it from your rearview mirror. It's a nice handy place to put it. In this particular case, we're gonna put in a brand new factory OEM, I believe it's a Bando on this one. And I'll make the part numbers available later on in the description link, so make sure to look in the description to find it. And so now that we've got the alternator loosened up, if you look down in here, I will get my trusty pointer again. There is a 12 millimeter bolt here, and a 12 millimeter bolt there, and a 12 millimeter bolt here and here, and I believe there's another one down here. And if you want to know how many bolts is holding the water pump in, here's a quick little secret. Find your water pump. My flashlight just jumped off the front of the car. So today we're going to be using factory OEM design parts, like I like to do. Bando is actually one of the manufacturers for Toyota that makes their belt. So this is an OEM quality belt. And Aisin, which is the water pump I'm going to be using, this is a brand new. I almost never put a remanufactured water pump in a vehicle. It's just not worth it to me. I'd rather have a brand new one that the casing is not warped on. There's no problems with it. So we're going to get all this out. This one looks like it comes with new bolts, probably because there's a design change. Now I will tell you, if you get a package of bolts when you're doing a water pump on an import vehicle, especially Toyota or Honda, these are not there just so you change them, and I repeat, they're not there just so that you change them to new bolts. Usually it's because the wall on the water pump is thicker or thinner than what the original pump is, and if you use the wrong length bolt, it'll either not grab or it'll go through too far into the engine and it'll cause a problem, and they know that. So they do a lot of updates when they're manufacturing parts to make them bigger and better. One of the jokes I love to tell is this is not a chiclet pack. You don't get to eat these. These are put in there so that the moisture doesn't rust out the part. When you see this, toss it. Whatever you do, don't let your kids get a hold of it, because if they start chewing on it, it'll be an issue. Excuse me while I bend down and pick up my flashlight so my assistant doesn't trip on it. I'll lay it down sideways. Okay, so here's the water pump that we're going to be putting in. This is an Aisin. This is a factory original water pump. So this is what the manufacturer that built this. This is the same pump that would have been put on this engine at the factory. And how I can tell how many bolts we're going to have to deal with. And this is one of the few water pumps you'll get to see where the pulley stays on the pump the whole time. A lot of water pumps, there'll be 4 bolts on the face. You pull the pulley off and then you change the pump, put the pulley back on. This one, it's actually one piece. But you can see how we got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So there's 5 bolts holding this water pump on. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, because I don't want to waste a lot of time having the wrong part and tearing down a vehicle, is I'm going to look at the water pump and make sure that everything looks just like the one in the vehicle. Looks like all the spacings are the same. The only difference I can see visually is that the original factory water pump has a kick out. Probably hard for you guys to see, but there's a little bit of a lip on the edge of the pulley, but it's not going to matter because that's not going to hold the belt on. It's not where the belt tracks. So I'm going to go ahead and set this aside. Looks like they gave us a new, it's what I would call a D-ring seal. It's not an O-ring. It's too thick for that. Technically, it's not a D-ring, but it's not an O-ring either. So these are great seals. I actually like them. They're fairly easy to work with. So the next step on this for me is find yourself a nice suitable drain pan. This is almost as big as the car, so there's a pretty good chance I'll get something inside of this bucket when I drop the water pump. So I'm going to slide that underneath the front of the engine. And then even though we have the hood light on here, it's still a little dark under here, so for video purposes, I'm going to try to give you guys as much light as I can. So what we're going to be working with is we're going to be taking off the 5 bolts. Not that one, that's alternator bolt. The 5 bolts are all going to be a 12mm head that are around this pump. Now the one on the bottom down here is going to be the hardest one to get to, and you're kind of going to have to find it with your feely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to a shorter 3/8 ratchet with the same 12mm deep socket. I've also got a 3/8 stubby standing by to save time if we need to. I'm going to find that bolt down here on the water pump, down here in La La Land. And then once I'm on it, there was not going to be a lot of movement necessary to loosen these water pump bolts. And the reason why is because they're only torqued to about 20 foot-pounds or so. I haven't looked it up yet, but there's not a lot of torque to them. Once I loosen it, I can just take and screw this thing all the way out. You notice I took the ratchet off because it's so easy to turn. You don't really have to sit there and fight it. Okay, so here's our first bolt. And I'm going to show you something that you can do. These things right here are lifesavers. These are magnet trays. And they will hold your bolts. If you put bolts down in any of these areas and line them up against your fenders, trust me, anybody will tell you, you're not going to find them all again. Not most of the time. It only takes one thing to get dropped. As a matter of fact, putting tools in your fender well is not a smart idea. I tell my son not to do that, who's videotaping us. Hi, Justin. And then I do it and I drop a wrench down in the fender and he's like, well, you told me not to do it and then you did it. Yeah. So go ahead and come down in here. We're going to take the rest of these 5, there's 4 more bolts holding this pump in. And what's going to happen when this pump is completely loose and comes off is it's going to start putting water down into the bucket. It's going to leak it right down past the frame. Now, there's probably going to be some comments made about me putting antifreeze across the top of the air conditioning pulley. I'm going to ignore them because I'm not worried about that too much. I'm going to blow that thing dry when I'm done anyway. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm going around and I'm loosening the remaining 4 bolts on this water pump. I'm going to get them to where I can pull them all out by hand. The exciting part is going to be when I try to pull this water pump out through the top and see if I can figure out exactly the trick little hole to line it up with so that it'll come out without having to force it. So I've only got a couple of these bolts out, but if you notice, see how loose this pulley is? Can you see that? See that? Hear that noise? Yeah, this water pump's shot. So there's the number 2 bolt. This is why the stubby is really handy, because sometimes those long ratchets don't fit very well in here. And so I just use this little stubby. It works out real well. But you do not have to have a stubby little ratchet. It's not mandatory for this job. Oh, I see coolant coming out. And just, you know, I like to explain why I do stuff the way I do it. It's not a shortcut, not draining the radiator so much to me. What it is that the drain valves on these radiators, especially when these cars get upwards of 150, 200,000 miles and they're still on their original radiator, the problem I have is that drain valve will sometimes break when you go to unscrew it. And it came in for a water pump, not a radiator. I'd like the radiator to go out in one piece. So I just don't do the... Okay, now this bolt right here and this bolt right here are a different length than the other 3. Okay, so make sure when they go back in, they go back in where they came out. So just be careful to keep an eye on that. And so there's one more bolt underneath there that I need to get out. And I believe I'm going to have to get in your view to do it. So hopefully I explained why I don't like to always drain the radiators. If the radiators have been maintained properly, coolant's been flushed on a regular basis and all that goody stuff, then you're usually pretty good. But those little plastic drain valves on these radiators are very temperamental, and if you try to unscrew it and force it to drain it into a pan. More often than not, you'll end up cracking that valve, and then you got to replace your radiator. There's really nothing wrong with the radiator. So there's the third bolt. Just go ahead and show them that. That's the third bolt that, let me look at the camera so you can hear me. So you got 3 short bolts and 3 long bolts. And you'll know which ones are which when you put them back in, mainly because if you look at the front of the engine block and the water pump. Okay, so the way I'm gonna pull this out is I'm gonna come up between the alternator pulley and the ABS control module. See right here where the impeller is for the water pump? And then I'm just gonna kind of move the air conditioning hose out of the way. Wow, the pulley's actually seizing. That's the noise customer was hearing. And that pulley's not supposed to do that. So this is the original water pump. And as you can see, it says ASIN on it. AISIN, that's the original pump. And that's what we're putting back in it. And so the next step now, find yourself a little pocket screwdriver or a pick or something sharp. If you got a good fingernail, you can use that. What you're going to do is you're going to come down in here. See this O-ring right here, or the D-ring, whatever you want to call it? This is the sealing surface for the water pump. Just reach down underneath it and pull it out. And that's the seal for your water pump. Now, you'll hear me trash a lot of the engineering feats that we come up with on the newer cars. The newer style gaskets, I actually like these. And the reason why is I've been doing this 32 years plus professionally, and then all the way back to childhood. And when I was younger, we used to have gaskets that were glued onto the engine. And on the older Toyotas and Hondas and Chevys and everything, when you got that pump off, you used to have to sit there with scrapers and razor blades for however long, 15 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever it took, to scrape all the old gasket off. Now you just peel off the seal, put a new seal in, so that's pretty nice. The downfall to that is that a lot of the rubber seals we have for like oil, it's a plastic housing with a rubber seal on it, and they'll dry up and they'll leak when they get old, and so you have to take stuff apart to fix them. That's the downfall to it. I actually like the design. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to pull the seal out of here. And the instructions. And people are probably going to laugh when I say this, but instructions are for people that don't know what they're doing. All joking aside, still read them just in case there's an update. Let's see. Water pump must be replaced by a qualified mechanic. Well, that's great. If you just bought this and you're doing it yourself at home, what do you do now? Water pump must not be installed in model years other than the applicable models. The shaft must not be struck with a hammer. That's actually good advice. The engine must not be started without cooling water. That's really good advice. No one should stay around the fan, especially blah, 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 etc., etc. Our water pump is guaranteed. Okay, so there's really no update. It's just a bunch of common sense for those of us that have common sense. So I'll put that in the trash can. And now what I want to know is they gave us 3 bolts. Remember I said at the beginning, anytime they give you bolts, it's usually not just because they want new bolts in there. Because if that was the case, how come they only gave us 3 brand new bolts and there's 6 bolts? Actually, I said 5, but there's 6 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 on there. So I actually pulled an extra bolt out on the bottom that didn't need to come out. So there's 5 bolts on this. One of the bolts on the bottom, I accidentally removed blind. It's not going to hurt anything. I just have to make sure when I put it back in. I'm going to do that before I put the pump in. That way I know it's tight. But that happens from time to time. We're not losing any time. But here's what I'm getting at. All 3 of these long bolts are the same length. Even the one that I pulled out that's not supposed to come out. Look how much longer it is than the ones they gave us. So why? Let's ask ourselves honestly, why would they give us 3 short bolts? So they probably redesigned this pump and updated it. So let's look at this pump and see what's different that's going to require the bolts to be shorter or longer. The bolt pattern's the same. Okay, so the thickness of the housing is different.
Speaking as the hapless viewer, aren't there already 3 shorter bolts?
Yes, but those have to go back in the shorter holes that they came out of. Legitimate question. You can keep that if you want.
Yeah, but might not those be the replacements for those shorter bolts?
Yes, exactly.
You were comparing them. You were comparing them to the longer bolts first.
That's true. I was comparing them to the longer ones, but they may be for the shorter ones, which is actually what they're for. Justin is correct. Let's leave that in there. Let's give him an attaboy. He figured it out. Super genius. It is because the original water pump has this really thin wall. And the bolt goes through, and you always want about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of threads on the back side to have a proper tightening. Drop that on the ground. Well, now we're going to be looking at this. That bolt's a little too short now, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
How about now? There we go. All right. I know that bored you guys to death, and gals, but yeah. This is what makes a good mechanic is the small details and making sure that they get this right. It's not a lot of times rocket science. It's a matter of paying attention, being competent, using common sense. Common sense is extremely important in mechanics. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this seal back in. This seal actually has little bumps on it that's going to help it stay in the hole. If you push this in and it keeps falling out, which I haven't got to yet, if it keeps falling out on you and it won't stay in, put a little bit of Vaseline on it. Sometimes the wheel bearing grease, if you guys are used to doing that, the wheel bearing grease will eat the rubber where the Vaseline won't always. Or use a non-rubber degrading silicone sealant, just a little bit, just to keep it tucked in the hole. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take and I'm going to line up the small side first, and I'm working completely blind because the camera's right in front of my face. And I'm going to push this thing into this little hole. And the nice thing about this type of seal is, unlike a silicone seal, it doesn't matter if you've got a little bit of water on the sealing surface, because we're not using a sealant. So we don't have to have a dry surface. We can actually use it this way. So I'm going to put my 3 new bolts up there. Now I know that because of the way this kind of looks like a turbine, okay, we need to make sure that it lines up the same way when it goes back down in there. So we're going to go back in the opposite way we came out. We're going to lift this up. We're going to come around. We're going to go back under here. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to put the bolt back in the timing cover that came out. So if you look down in here, let me get my pointer. See this bolt hole right here on this timing cover? That's the one that I pulled out by accident at the bottom of the water pump. So I'm going to take and put just a dab of silicone on it, because there was silicone on it before. Just on the threads, just a dab. You don't have to smear it in really, really bad. Just in case anybody's going to ask. The stuff that I'm using is called 1211, and it's 3-bond is the manufacturer. When it comes to putting timing covers and stuff on with no gasket, it's the best stuff ever. The only stuff I ever found that's been as good as this, which I don't use anymore because it's too expensive and too hard to get a hold of, is a sealant called Bond.
Okay, so I'm gonna grab a flashlight and then I'm gonna put that right there in that hole, and then I'm gonna tighten this thing down.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I looked up my torque spec for the timing cover bolts and the water pump bolts, and the shorter bolts on the water pump are supposed to be torqued at 18 foot-pounds. The longer bolts are supposed to be torqued at 19 foot-pounds, and I can tell you right now 1 foot-pound is not going to change anything drastic. So I'm going to set my torque wrench to 19 foot-pounds, and the first bolt I'm going to torque is that one that we just put in. You hear it click? Now that it fell off the bolt, let's try it again. Yep. Okay, so now that that's done, I'm going to go back in here and double check it just to make sure that I was on the right one, because that clicked awful early. It sounds like it might have been on a different bolt. Yep, I was on the one right above it. This light doesn't like to stay pointing in the direction you want it to. It always rotates back up facing you. I don't know why. So I'm trying to get this bolt to tighten down to the point that my torque wrench clicks. There we go. Okay, so now it's at 20. So now I'm going to go ahead. Now I'm going to put the water pump in. So I'm going to go back in. This time I can go in this way. Just move the air conditioning hose out of the way. Make sure to put it back in its little holder that it pops out of. Make sure that your water pump is lined up in the right position. Just like that. We're going to take this long bolt. I'm going to switch it over to my left hand that's holding the water pump, and I'm going to start this. Now these bolts here did not have silicone on them, so I'm not going to silicone them because it's not going to be required. So I'm going to put the first long bolt in the top hole right here, and then I'm going to grab the next long bolt, and the next long bolt should, if everything goes right, go in the next hole down. Because if you put the shorter bolts in here, they're going to probably be almost seated before you even start tightening them. So the two longer bolts are going to go into the timing cover. And now we're going to take the three new bolts that they sent us, and they are going to make up the other three holes. And I'm going to get them started by hand as far as I can go, because it makes that much less socket and ratchet work I have to do. Remember that the two longer ones were over towards the back of the engine on the cover, and then the three brand new ones are going to be towards the radiator around the water pump. And then this next one is going to be the fun one. Now, for those of you at home, if you jack your vehicle up and put it safely on stands and pull the plastic cover off of inside your fender well, you can get to this bolt a lot easier. I'm going to do it the opposite way and actually just put my hand down in here, and I've got to figure out exactly where that hole is. I'm going to find it with my finger. And then there it is. And then once I find it with my finger, I'm going to go ahead and put that down in there. But they can see how I'm using two fingers on both sides to screw that down in as far as I can. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get my stubby ratchet, put it to the on position. Kind of a joke. And then I'm going to reach down in here and I'm going to just snug these things up. Now the good thing is, two of these bolts are now 12 millimeters, and the brand new ones have a bigger head on them.
So we're gonna have to switch sockets to tighten down all 5 water pump bolts. Okay, so I got those 2. Now I gotta figure out, I'm probably assuming that the new bolts are probably 13 millimeter. I'm just gonna assume that, and I'm grabbing a 13, yep, they're 13 millimeter. So I'm going to get them snugged up the best I can. And all I'm doing right now is just going finger tight. But with the little ratchet, and I'm just going around in a circle, starting and working my way around in a clockwise motion. There's not a lot of room in the front of these engines, so you just kind of have to do the best you can. This is why I use a stubby, because the big long ratchets are really hard to deal with when you're swinging them. They take up so much space. But you can do it with them. And then one more, and that's that hidden one down on the bottom. And that one I'm going to do with the full length ratchet, because my arm, I've got Popeye arms, always have. I got really big forearms, and it's really hard for me to get down in some of these tight corners. So once you get this tightened down, you're going to torque all these to 19 foot-pounds. Okay, so all I'm doing right now is I'm torquing these bolts that we had just put in on the water pump. There's 5 of them. You didn't see me go in on that one that I just torqued because we were swapping a battery out on the recording device. But if you put the bolts in, then you pretty much know where they're at. You don't have to torque these. If you want to use a hand wrench to tighten them back down, you know, go ahead. I want to make sure it's done to spec. And so this bottom one, I'm telling you guys right now, do it yourself at home. Put this car up on jacks, pull your right front tire off, or pull the splash panel off on the inside of your frame, and do this bolt from the bottom, because I've lost more time. It would have been quicker for me to just pull the tire off on this rack, and I'm having a hard time getting this bolt tight. Listen folks, I win. That's the bottom one, the one that was hard to get to. And literally, if you take off your tire, jack it up, put safety stands underneath it, there's a plastic shield in there that you can pull off that exposes the front of the engine. It'll make doing the bottom bolts a lot easier. So now the next thing I'm going to do from this point is to spin the pulley on the water pump. Make sure that it's not dragging, it's not making any noise, because if something didn't get done right and you hear it making a bunch of metal sounds when you spin it, it means you didn't bolt it on right. So now that that's done, because I poured water all over the air conditioning pulley, I'm going to clean it off with air. So what I just did, other than made my hearing start to ring, is I just blew off all the moisture off of the pulleys and off of the electromagnet behind the air compressor, just so that it's dry. And the next step is our fan belt. So at this point, don't throw your box away until you absolutely know it's the right belt. But there's the part number for the one I'm going to use, providing it matches up. I'll make sure that link is also in the description box when the video is finalized. So take both belts, put them side by side, put your thumb on it, and pull. And what you want is both belts to be basically the same length. You can be off by just a hair, but if you end up stretching it out and you got belts that look like that when you stretch it out, well, one tight and one not like that, then the one belt's too long.
I'm kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Not a perfectionist, but I like attention to detail. So I'm gonna put it where the words are facing you when it's on the engine. You don't necessarily have to do that as long as there's no arrows on the belt telling you that it has to spin in a certain direction. So take your belt and feed it down in here.
And get it on your crank pulley. Remember your belt routing.
And I'm going to show you a neat little trick. This little tool right here looks like a long screwdriver, only it's got a cool little fork on the end of it. This is a belt installer tool that just helps you be able to reach down in and grab a belt and move it and put it around a pulley and so forth and all that good stuff. So you see how I was able to manipulate that? Now I got to put my hand in the way because if I don't keep tension on it, it's going to just keep falling back out. Okay, so now that that's there, I need to get the belt around the bottom of the air conditioning pulley also. And it fell off of the crank pulley again, and this is part of your competency test, is making sure that you can get it onto all the pulleys that it needs to go around. Okay, so now we are on the air conditioner and the water pump, and I'm going to push the alternator back in because remember it has to be on the slack side to be able to get that lined up, and I'm going to reach down in here with a finger and put the belt around the water pump pulley on the smooth side. And then what I'm going to do, so what we're going to do right now is we're going to look down in here with my red flashlight, and we're just going to verify that the belt is centered on each pulley. Crank pulley, power steering pulley, making sure that there's a front and a back to each pulley so that we're not off by one tooth. So now you got your belt on and you need to adjust your alternator. Now this is where you need a little bit of common sense and to not hurt the pulleys, because if you over tighten this, I really like these adjusters because they make it easy to tighten. You don't have to use pry bars anymore. The downfall to them is if you just tighten them up until they're super tight, you can make the AC compressor bearings fail, the water pump bearings fail, the alternator bearings fail. And so there's actually a specific movement on the belt, and it is so technical to go over most of the time. I generally don't even try to describe it. I just tell you to just use common sense. So once I'm at 0, where this thing's screwed in and it's no longer able to move by hand, see how much flex this belt has? You don't want that. That's going to cause a squeal. So I'm going to tighten this bolt down until this thing gets tighter, but not banjo tight. You don't want to, you're not playing the guitar on this thing. You want about a ½ an inch of flex on the belt, top and bottom. So see that? About a ½ an inch up and down, and you should be fine. So now we're going to take our 12mm and we're going to tighten up this top bolt on the alternator, and then we're going to take and switch over to the 14mm, and we're going to get down here and we're going to do the bottom bolt for the alternator. We're going to get that nice and snug and tight. And then remember I said to make sure you put your air conditioning hose back in the fitting, because I popped that out. And so now we get to the point where we're going to be putting coolant back in here. Now the coolant that this car takes is an Asian version. It's called pink antifreeze. This is what came with it from the factory. And this is consolidated, or is this 50/50? 50-50 pre-diluted. So I don't have to mix this. I can just simply top the car off with it. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we're going to purge the cooling system, add coolant to the system, and get the air out of the engine. In the old school days, you used to just pour the coolant down in here and start the engine up. It usually would kick fluid everywhere, make a mess, make it really hard to get the air out of the block. This is a self-purging funnel. Helps you get the air out, and I'll show you how it works. You find the adapter that fits your radiator. There's a bunch of different adapters in the kit. And you put your funnel in, push it down, and it's going to stay on there. And what you're going to do is you're going to take and you're going to pour your coolant in. And you're just going to sit and you're going to wait, and you're going to see it's going to bubble up, because what you're seeing, the bubbles, you're seeing the air that's in the engine coming out, and as it comes out, the fresh coolant goes in. And this is the best way to purge a block. This is the best way to make sure that you're not going to run it hot when you're warming it up. The best thing to do is to just keep doing this and letting it sit for half an hour or so until you don't see bubbles come out of it anymore, but there's coolant in the actual funnel if you're using this particular device. And what I'm going to do to cheat, I'm going to look at how much water I took out, coolant, and I took out about half a gallon, 3/4 of a gallon when I drained the water pump. So when I pulled the water pump off, it only drained the cooling system partially, only down to the bottom of the water pump housing. So everything from the water pump housing down in both the engine and the radiator is still there. So all I'm doing is topping it back off. If you want complete coolant change, go ahead and drain your radiator, and then there's a valve on the side of the engine which you have to locate, which usually has a 10 or a 12 millimeter bolt on it, and you can loosen it and it'll drain the block too. That's if you want to do a full coolant purge. This car's got such low miles on it, it doesn't necessarily need an entire coolant swap. We're just going to put the factory coolant back in. And then we're just going to keep doing this. Now this purging funnel has this cool little tool in it right here, which can go down in there and stop coolant from either going into the radiator or from air from coming out. This is going to come in really handy to get this bucket off without making a mess. So just set that out of the way. Now usually your coolant bottle, your overflow bottle, which is this bottle right here, is low on coolant. So when you do the warm up, you can take what's left in the funnel and just dump it in there instead of having to put it, you know, wherever you dispose of it. In this particular case, it's already full, so we're not going to be able to do that. But you notice how the bubbles are slowing down. So I'm going to start the car right now before I put the cover back on it, and I'm going to put the dipstick back in the hole so that it doesn't spit oil at me. I'm going to start the engine, so contact. Now once you start the engine, what I want you to look for is I immediately want you to check your pulleys. Hear that squeal? That's because the fan belt's still a little loose. So the fan belt still needs to be tightened down just a little bit. But right now, before I get into doing that, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that all these bubbles that you see coming up out of here, they stop. Once all the bubbles stop coming up and there's coolant in the funnel, then I know that the cooling system is purged. And I'm going to be checking the upper radiator hose to see when the upper radiator hose gets hot. The thermostat on this vehicle is in the cylinder head, not in the block, so it's on the hot side, not the cold side. So when the upper radiator hose on this vehicle gets hot and or the cooling fans come on, I know the system's going to be purged. So you have to make sure there's no air in the engine when you go to refire it back up if it's going to run for a long time, because you don't want it to overheat. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video so that you guys don't have to sit here. This usually takes about 10 to 15 minutes for this particular stage. And then we'll disconnect, we'll put the engine cover back on, and we'll check for leaks, and the video will be done. So we'll see you in about 10-15 minutes. Okay, so this is pretty much the end of the video. I'm going to show you how to wrap this up. I've let the vehicle run for a while. I've kept an eye on the temperature gauge to make sure it didn't go above halfway. I kept checking the upper radiator hose, which is right here, and it is super hot right now. I also carefully, without getting my hands in the fan blade, would reach down and check the lower radiator hose, and now it's warm. So I know that the system has circulated and there's no more air bubbles coming out of this. So if you're using one of these funnels, take and squeeze your upper radiator hose completely flat, put that in, and then let go of your radiator hose. What that's going to do is it's going to push a little fluid up. You're going to seal it, and then when you pull this off, it doesn't spill. See this? It's completely dry. So now we can take and back that off, take our radiator cap, put our radiator cap back on the vehicle. I'm going to set this aside, and then I'm going to take our sound deadening equipment, pull my dipstick back out, wipe the oil off of it. I don't want to break that off. Remember, those things are really touchy. Best way to put this back on is just line up your oil cap, push the two back panels back down in, and then the two front panels, and you'll notice that it's nice and tight on all the corners. Put your dipstick back down in there, and now you're done. Now on this one, we heard the fan belt squeal, and it wasn't because the belt was loose, it was because there was antifreeze on the bottom of the pulleys and it got the belt wet. The belt ended up with what's, antifreeze is a lubricant, and it allowed it to spin on the pulley. So now the vehicle's been shut off and started back up, and the belt tension's right. It's fine. That can happen. So that's pretty much the heads up. I'm Ron with Mobile Fix Automotive. Hopefully this helps you change the water pump on your Toyota Corolla, and we'll see you on the next video. Thank you.